the most important part of this lecture is dedicated to case study research, which is one approach to qualitative research. A case study is an empirical inquiry that investigates a contemporary phenomenon within its real-life context. Case study research is quite popular in management research in general, among students, among qualitative researchers, but even among quantitative researchers. And just to start immediately with kind of getting rid of one of the big prejudices against case study research, it's not popular because it's easy. It's popular because it is specific, it's demarcated, it's tangible, which is often a good way to start a research project. As Flitbjörk, one of the main authors I'm drawing on today, also notes, a scientific discipline without a large number of thoroughly executed case studies is a discipline without systematic production of exemplars, and a discipline without exemplars is an ineffective one. So case studies are very much the example of empirical research. What we're going to discuss today is what a case study is, also what a case study is not, when you can use it, what its main functions are, which is related to the previous, the different types that there are, the strengths and weaknesses of case study approach, and, very important, how to actually do it, how to actually make a case study research, how to implement it in terms of sampling, sources, analysis, and presentation. And all these things are interrelated, as you will see, and the strengths and weaknesses of a case study are obviously related to when you should and should not use them and how you should or should not implement them. So what is a case study? In the most simple terms, a case study is an approach or methodology centering on a concrete case. An event, an organization, a person, a phenomenon, a development, a dynamic. And this approach has the dual aim of understanding first the case as such, and mostly through understanding the case, understanding similar cases. We will get into that more as it implies generalizability. The features or characteristics as named by Yin, which is, so to say, the godfather of case study research. He has done some seminal work on what a case study is and how you should do it. But case studies can be quantitative or qualitative or mixed. They usually are concerned with why and how questions rather than what and how much. The research question is form and substance, and with that we mean it's demarcated to place, time, and actors. It focuses on contemporary events, or at least that's what Yin says. I think there are very good examples of historical case studies, but they might be a bit more complex or complicated to conduct, considering the next element that Yin identifies, namely that case studies use varying units of analysis. Single individuals, large corporations, businesses, but also they use a variety of lines of action in data gathering. That basically just means that they use a lot of different data sources. So surveys and observations and focus groups and documents and interviews. That can make historical case studies a bit complex because you can't obviously conduct focus groups or interviews, but nevertheless, they do exist, historical case studies. Last but certainly not least is that case studies make use of and contribute to theory. So it's also important, I think, to stress here what a case study is not. And there are a lot of misunderstandings about case study research, and subsequently there's also a lot of authors devoting energy to refuting these misunderstandings. For instance, Flitbjörk, Bloomberg, that I mentioned before in the literature list. And many of these issues hold for qualitative research in general. But a case study research is not a survey in context. It's also not an experiment or an ethnography in context. Context is not a nice extra but an essential explanatory factor in case study research. It's also not the only qualitative approach. There are a lot of qualitative researchers that do not involve case studies. It's also, as I mentioned at the beginning, not necessarily easier than other approaches. It's also not more biased than other approaches, for instance, a survey or an experiment or an ethnography. And we will get into this a bit more later. Very importantly, you've got to know when it's useful, it's beneficial to use a case study approach, and when it's not. You might want to consider using a case study when your research interest is very context specific, or when the number of variables to be considered is either unknown or very large. Interestingly, there's also been a lot of evaluative or impact monitoring research done through case studies. So that's also one application of the case study approach. It's also important to think of when you should maybe not use a case study approach. Things you can think of, as mentioned in the literature, are it might not be a good idea to use a case study when you have a very limited variety of sources, when you can easily manipulate the behavior of those involved in the study, or when you're only interested in a specific case as kind of an illustration rather than as, the main source of your analysis. Case studies can have different functions, the kind of the usual functions that you know from the literature. Case studies can be exploratory, they're often used as pilot studies. As you will see, even in quantitative research, often a case study is underlying even the development of the research. Case studies can also be explanatory. This is if you are interested in causal studies, specifically causal studies where there is a plurality of influences that determine the causal relation you're interested in. Case studies, furthermore, can be descriptive. Then there is the use of descriptive theory throughout the study. And as said before, case studies can be evaluative, as in the case of impact monitoring, for instance. But often what you see is that it's not just one of these, that there is a mixture of functions in the application of case study research. Now we get to the bit more challenging components of case study research, which is the types of case studies. And we can distinguish different case studies, different types of case studies based on objectives that they have or based on design that they have. And I think these two are linked. If you make a distinction based on the objective of the research, you can identify intrinsic case studies that want to understand a particular case that's very unique or very representative as it is, or instrumental case studies which seek to provide insights into an issue or refine a theoretical explanation, making it more generalizable. Here there's often a comparative element between different cases that are being studied. The question here is really about the relation between the case and the context and the theory. In intrinsic case studies, you use theory to understand the case. In instrumental case studies, you use cases to develop theory. A second distinction between different types of case studies can be made based on the design of your study. Single case studies, as is kind of inherent in the name, study one specific case. Multiple case studies study several cases at once, often in comparative mode. It's logical, but not necessarily 100% of the cases evident that intrinsic case studies are often single cases and instrumental case studies are often multiple case designs. If we go back to Yin, he has a slightly different distinction, but it's more or less the same. He also uses a distinction between single and multiple cases, but instead of intrinsic and instrumental, he uses holistic and embedded as distinctions. it's very crucial to distinguish between these different case study designs. We will get into all the aspects of these 4 different possibilities on the basis of the next picture, where you can see in this matrix how on the one hand either a holistic or an embedded design and a single or a multiple case design make up 4 different case study designs. To start with the single holistic case design, there you have one case that is studied in its entirety. To take an example, if we are interested in corporate social responsibility in the hotel industry, we can construe various case study designs. We could say we'll take a single holistic approach, which means we will look at corporate social responsibility within one hotel. Let's call it a Hotel A. However, we could also say we will take a holistic multiple case design, which we will say we will look at corporate social responsibility in several hotels, Hotel A and Hotel B. Then a third option is to say we will take a single case, but an embedded single case design. That means that we will still only be looking at one hotel, but within this hotel we will distinguish specific units, for instance, the food and beverage department and the housekeeping department. So we will compare the corporate social responsibility practices in 2 different departments in the same hotel. If we go to the 4th and last option for case study design, it's embedded and multiple, which means that we will look at different departments in different hotels. So we will look at corporate social responsibility in the food and beverage department and in the housekeeping department in several hotels. Here you will see that these 4 different designs also allow you to make different claims regarding your conclusions. There are several weaknesses that can be attributed to a case study approach, as with all data gathering methods or methodology or research methodologies. Well, first of all, it's important to stress that obviously a case study approach is weak when you use it in a situation for which it's not suitable. And if you are using it to answer a research question that's much more geared to, for instance, a quantitative approach, or that's not demarcated to a specific time or place or sector. But even when your project does call for a case study approach, there are various pitfalls. Often you will hear that case study research is very difficult to generalize. This is indeed a very important issue, and a lot of articles deal with it. There's a lot of skepticism about, case study research in specific, but qualitative research in general, and how it, enables generalization, and whether it even enables generalization. We will get into this in depth in the lecture on validity later in this module. But what I can say now that indeed there are several strategies or responses to this challenge to generalize. For instance, the clustering of case studies, different case studies together, can produce a body of evidence that can be generalized. Transferability or generalization can also work through theory or through conceptualization. And then the generalization is based on contribution to theory rather than generalization from a sample to a population. Again, we will discuss all these things in depth in a later lecture. But it is important to stress that it is in fact the use of theory that makes case study research go, or enables it to go beyond the specific case. Another form of generalization is through falsification, identifying the black swans, so to say. One good executed case study can refute a generalized claim that exists, and in that sense, it's generalizable. A second, weakness that people often attribute to case study approach is that it's biased. As said, bias is kind of a problematic concept under interpretivism because it's taken for granted that all research is biased, and the question is more to understand how it is biased rather than to pretend that something such as unbiased research exists. But even if that's true, it's interesting to realize that most case study researchers actually refute the assumptions that they held before. So it doesn't really necessarily tend to confirm what people already believed. A third aspect is that people often say a case study approach is so hard to demarcate. This is true in a sense, but on the other hand, the fluidity between the case and the context is exactly, why a case study approach was needed in the first place. Moreover, there are definitely strategies to demarcate or narrow down specific cases, for instance, specifying them in time and place or through specific theories or concepts. Finally, as a fourth weakness, it's often said, that it's very difficult to summarize or present case study research because the data is so rich and in depth. Yeah, and I think this is not just for case study, but it's really a question bound to haunt many people carrying out in-depth dense case studies. And who will want to learn about a case like this and in this kind of detail, as Flippiuk says? This is really the paradox. No one wants to read an immense, 300-page case description, but then on the other hand, the very richness and depth that is the selling point of case study research might be lost if you summarize it. There are various ways to deal with it, which we'll also discuss in the lecture on how to present qualitative data. I will leave you now to read this quotation by Flippiuk. That is one response to the issue of the challenge to summarize or present qualitative data, case study data. But of course, otherwise we wouldn't be here discussing the issue. There's also a lot of potential strength of case study approaches. First of all, and I think this might be the most important, case study research is holistic. It's able to deal with a full variety of evidence, different sources, documents, interviewed, artifacts, observations, multiple sources of evidence that you can use to critically understand each of them through triangulation. There's a pitfall. It's easy to get lost in the data, but don't be too scared of that, as that is just the other side of the coin that presents the biggest strength of case study research, which is that it's holistic. It also acknowledges context. That is crucial. It can be different forms of context: cultural, social, geographical, historical, but all these things that are hard to estimate from the beginning, it can be incorporated in a case study approach. That might also mean that it's easy to lose focus, but as we said before, there are ways to deal with that. A third strength of case study research is that it provides the real-life, practical, and empirical data input that any discipline in research needs. It's not just that it helps you understand the specific phenomenon, it's also that in producing a case study you kind of add to the empirical reservoir for other researches. As Flippiuk again notes, phenomenological studies of the learning process emphasize the importance of this and similar methods. It's only because of experience with cases that one can move at all from a beginner to being an expert. If people were exclusively trained in context-independent knowledge and rules, that is the kind of knowledge that forms the basis of textbooks and computers, they would remain at the beginner's level in the learning process. So now we will move on to how to implement case study research, and this is, where the real deal begins. There are 6 main steps to most qualitative research, but specifically case study research. And I will assume here that you know the basic tenets of literature review, research question, conceptual framework, and research design. And I will specifically highlight here what is relevant, what is unique to case study research, as opposed to, you know, what is general for all qualitative research. But first we need to establish the purpose, then determine the unit of analysis, then select the relevant sample, further select the relevant data sources, then analyze and build the theory, and then obviously present what we found. So to start with the first step, establishing the purpose. And of course, I mean, this is crucial for any research, but I think in case of research it might be particularly important, because what you have to ask yourself is, do you start out with the case, or do you start out with the question? Do you know already which case you want to research, in which case you will probably take an intrinsic approach, or do you have a specific research question for which you still need to find cases to understand it, in which case you need a holistic approach? The same question needs to be answered for the instrumental or intrinsic approach. No, correct me. The distinction that has to be made is either will you take an intrinsic/holistic approach, or will you take an instrumental or embedded approach? Do you prioritize the case and use theory to understand it, or do you want to answer a specific question and do you need cases to do so? Based on that, you also then choose whether you have a single or a multiple design, and which are your kind of leading propositions. In many cases, people know very well what they are looking for in a case study, so you will need to, you know, have quite specific propositions. It depends on the degree to which your case study is deductive or inductive. A very important thing, you know, to establish for yourself whether you understand the nature of case study research is whether the case in the case study research necessarily coincides with the dependent variable in your research. In fact, this is what is often presented, this is what is often thought. I would argue that this is not the case. In the case study approach, the case is the unit of analysis. A specific property about the case, the one that you sample on, is the dependent variable. In the research I mentioned previously about the relation between service delivery and state legitimacy, the dependent variable obviously was state legitimacy, and the independent variable was service delivery. Our case, however, were service projects, service provision projects. It is through these service provision projects that we research the relation between service delivery and state legitimacy. So the case in case research is not the same as the dependent variable, but rather as the unit of analysis. This brings us to our second step of implementation in implementing a case study research, which is determining the unit of analysis, or determining your case. And again, a case can basically be anything. It can be specific events, it can be actors, specific people, unions, working groups, individuals. It can be programs, it can be projects, it can be phenomena. This is basically dependent on your question and your theory. What you really have to ask yourself is, what do you want to analyze? Here again, I want to give 2 examples. In the first example, as I said, the first example I already gave related to the research research on the relationship between service delivery and state legitimacy, which was researched through the case of projects. A second example is my own PhD research, where my dependent variable is governance interaction, my independent variable is material and immaterial resources, and my cases are specific events that happened. So you will see that these are the three things that you have to have completely clear if you are designing a case study research. What is your dependent variable? What is your independent variable? In which case might allow you to study the relation between the independent and dependent variable. If you got that straight, it's time to move on to the third step of implementing a case study, which is the sampling process. It's very important to stress here that sampling in case study research is theoretical, it's purposive, it's not statistical. The goal is to choose cases that are likely either to replicate or extend emergent theory, or to fill theoretical categories and provide examples of polar types. There's different logics that you can take for sampling cases. You can choose for extreme or deviant cases. You can that are very unique or very different. You can choose for very general, representative, typical cases that represent the average situation. You can look for maximum variation, that you have different cases that represent the most extreme varieties of a phenomenon you're researching. But really, this depends on your research question and your independent variable. And sometimes you will know beforehand which cases you will sample. Sometimes this will become clear throughout the research. So extreme or deviant cases, to stress that again, are these you would choose to obtain information on unusual cases which can be especially problematic or especially good in a more defined sense. They can be very revelatory. Maximum variation cases would be to obtain information about the significance of various circumstances for case process and outcome. Maybe 3 or 4 cases that are very different on one dimension, very different in size, very different in form, very different organization, and very typical cases, again, as said, they represent the average situation. Having, determined which case you want, then the next step is to select data sources. And here you already see the 4, I think, crucial data gathering techniques that we use in qualitative research, and that I will also, a specific lecture will be devoted to each of them specifically. But it's important to stress that one of the assets of case study research is the use and triangulation of different sources of data: interviews, focus groups, documents, participant observation. And here it's also interesting for you to see that whereas case study research is often seen as a method, it's actually not, it's an approach, because within case study research you would still use different data gathering methods, as you see here. Various questions you would want to ask yourself at this point to kind of explore to what extent you already grasp the case study logic. For instance, to what extent you would want to prefer informants from one target group or from many different target groups. The kind of documents that you might use in a case study as data. How you would actually combine different data sources. Can they complement each other? Would you sequence them? The question you also need to ask yourself is how to, when you can stop collecting data. All of these issues are important and depend on your specific research and your specific question. What I can say here is that, on them is that one would generally prefer to interview informants from different target groups, because that allows you to contrast what they are saying vis-a-vis each other. But again, this depends on your question. The kind of documents that could be very useful for a case study are reports, agendas, budget, memos, emails, articles. You can use them also as input for other forms of data gathering, such as interview guides. You can also use them to trace history and development. if you're looking at how to combine different data sources, I wouldn't necessarily combine them, but see how they are different and how you can explain these differences. Stop collecting data is one of the biggest challenges in any case study research, because there's always more to understand about a specific case if you're going in depth. With every question that's answered, new questions arise. But when you reach the point of saturation, also something we'll discuss in the other lectures in greater depth, when you reach the point of saturation, you can safely say that the added value of each new set of data that is collected is diminishing, then you can wrap up your data collection. So now you have established your purpose, you have determined your unit of analysis, you have selected your cases, and you have determined how to gather your data. Then the next step is how to analyze the data that you have. There will be a specific lecture that I will give on analysis and coding. So now I will specifically stress the bits and parts of analysis that are particular to case study research. How you can analyze case study data is by a process of constant comparison. You compare the data that you found to other data that you found. Several cases are then contrasted against each other. You can link your data to propositions that you draw from the theory. You can link your data to other case studies that have been conducted. You can link your data to theory. But in all this, the literature plays a crucial role. What you want to determine before all else is what is similar and what is different in your case studies and why that is the case. In terms of sequencing your analysis, I think this is quite important. You really want to adopt a bottom-up approach here. You want to go from small to larger units of analysis and maintain a view on the context. This is a kind of really a big difference with doing surveys. That is it's a dialogue between the findings and the concepts, and you take two basic steps. First is the within case analysis. Second, a cross case analysis. Within case analysis really emphasizes that you have to understand the unique patterns in each case before you start comparing it to other cases. So you have a very descriptive component, really understanding what is happening when, by whom, with what effect, for what reason. That allows you also to understand how the context is relevant in this specific case. It allows an in-depth understanding. And only when you understand the case as such, as a unit of analysis as such, can you move on to the second step of case study analysis, which is a cross-case analysis. And this is the step, the comparison and contrasting of the cases to identify patterns in the data that allows you to build theory that is grounded in the data, that is inductive in essence. And what you want to do then is select categories or dimensions and look for similarities or differences. You can do that in different ways by, for instance, dividing the data by data sources, compare patterns in the observational data with patterns in the interview data, select different categories of respondents, comparing patterns in the data from participants with patterns in the data from experts. But in all that, you have to keep in mind that you do your data analysis per case before you start the comparison. In the process of analyzing, you will also be involved in theory building, and this is the increasing abstraction that is part of your analysis. If you are contrasting your different cases, you will already be using different specific concepts and theories to do so. So what you will do throughout the process of analysis and theory building is defining and measuring specific constructs by constantly comparing the data and the constructs. So the ideas that you have, the concepts that you use, that you are looking for in your data, need to be compared to the actual empirical findings that you have. An important step is in the verification of the relationship between these constructs in the case 1, case 2, case 3, or all the cases that you do. And all of them have to make sense. If the proposition or the concept that you develop confirms the relationship between the cases, then you can include it. But the cases that disconfirm your analysis should not be thrown out. Rather, it means that you still have to refine, extend your concept or theory. And in all that, it's crucial to keep in mind the underlying logic of the relationship. We want to know not merely if there is a relationship between A and B, between independent variable and dependent variable. We want to understand why. And this is something you have to draw from your cases, and your answer will in the end have to be phrased in a way that it holds for all single cases that you discussed. What is very, very important in this sense, and if there's one thing you should take from this lecture, it's this specific slide, I would argue, is that therefore tensions, contradictions, gaps, and inconsistency should not be brushed under the rug, but should provide the main starting point for your analysis and should be actively exploited, sought for, delved into, and explained. And I think this is the biggest difference with, for instance, quantitative approaches to research, where you are looking for the average situation, where you are not interested in the outliers, and if something doesn't fit the data, you need to get rid of it, rather than, throwing your whole study based on one single detail. But here, this is the core feature of qualitative research. You will actively look for the exception rather than for the average. There remains then one final step in the implementation of a case study research, which is presentation. In one of my later lectures, I will give specific detail on how, what are the different strategies to present qualitative data. But here we can already say that Yin suggests 6 methods for reporting a case study, namely linear, comparative, chronological, theory building, suspense, and unsequenced. It is, of course, up to you and depends on your own motivation and legitimation of the choices you make, but it is most common in qualitative research and in case study research to present your data in either the comparative format, contrasting the different cases you did, or the theory building format, because in the end this is your contribution from the case research is not just to comparing specific cases, but also contributing to or questioning existing theory. So these two, comparative and theory building, are the most commonly used of Yin's 6 presentation options for qualitative case study research. And as I will stress, as I will want to wrap up now, what I will stress is that case studies are used in qualitative, quantitative, and mixed methods research. However, they are particularly popular in qualitative research because they uniquely combine focus and context. They are comprehensive and holistic. They are particularly useful when your research interest is very specific in place or time or sector, or when the number of variables to take into account is very unknown or large. As I will stress for each lecture that I will give here, these lectures are introductory stories. They are meant to whet your appetite and get you going in qualitative methods. However, if you decide a case study research approach is beneficial to your study, there is a lot more study and reading to do, and 2 of these references that I mentioned here can be very useful, especially that of yin. So if you have decided after this lecture that case study research might be beneficial to you, don't stop here, but make use of the abundant literature that exists. I finally will provide you with an assignment to really test for yourself. Have you understood the types and the merits of case study research? You can read that on your own. I would really like to thank you for your attention and for using this lecture for developing your research. If there are any questions, I would be more than willing to answer them. So feel free to contact me at this email address. And I hope to welcome you again in the next lecture on document analysis. Thank you very much.